Janice. You didn't know about Janice. Janice is a big movie buff, and she's probably seen, she's giving me a thumbs up now, though. Janice has seen a lot of movies. Maybe you've seen a lot of movies, or maybe you haven't seen that many over the course of your life or not. But regardless, probably everyone here today has a favorite movie or some favorite movies. And I don't know, there's no telling what your favorite movie may be or the type of movie it is. Some of you may have as your favorite some sort of romantic comedy. Maybe that's your type of movie, and so that stands out in your mind. Some of you, it may be that you like some of the classics. Maybe you like, for example, Gone with the Wind or something like that. Maybe some of you love mysteries, or it's a Western that stands out in your mind. And then, God forbid, there are some here today that your favorite movies are musicals, and I don't understand that. Like, some of you would say The Sound of Music is your favorite movie, and I'm like, oh. Didn't they use that at Gitmo on terrorists to extract confessions? And I'm like, oh, I could not bear that. Anyway, as for me, I'm a little pressed if you had to say, or it would be a little difficult for me to say exactly what my favorite is. I will say this. My absolute favorite movies, for whatever reason, are war movies. I love war movies, and I've always been that way. But because of that, I probably have to say that my favorite, just by virtue of the sheer number of times that I've seen it, I suppose, is Patton. I've seen that movie probably a dozen or more times over the years, and some of you, maybe many of you, have seen it. It came out in 1970. George C. Scott is playing George S. Patton. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, and is kind of a biographical look at Patton's military career during World War II as he winds up leading the 3rd Armored Division, or the 3rd Army, rather. And anyway, I've seen that movie a stack of times. And because I've seen it a stack of times, I know exactly how it ends. And if you've watched that movie, you perhaps recall how it ends. That Patton he's walking off in the distance. There's a windmill kind of turning over to the side, and he's walking off into the distance with his white dog on a leash, just kind of walking off. And I thought, that's not how this movie should end. That's not the right ending for this. But not only do I know how that movie ends, I know how and you may be familiar with how his life actually ends. That after World War II, he is still in Europe. A friend of his, somebody in the army, is going to take him hunting. And as they go out hunting, their vehicle is struck by low speeds by another army truck. What didn't seem to be a particularly tragic accident, not a complete loss necessarily, but the injuries that Patton experienced put him in the hospital in critical condition, where 12 days later he died because of a car wreck. And I think about that ending, and I'm thinking, that's not how the story should end. That movie shouldn't end this way. Patton's life shouldn't end this way. Here you've got this guy that he's not a big man, but he's got this personality that's larger than life. And he's this man that has an unusually gifted mind for understanding warcraft, and He's this larger-than-life personality, and if I'm writing the ending, if I have any say-so in that somehow in the last battle of the last fight of World War II, the last shot that is fired as his armies are crushing the Nazis, that there's almost a lucky shot and he is mortally wounded. I don't like that ending, but at least somehow that seems to fit. But that's not the ending that either the movie or Patton himself got. I want you to think with me today about endings. And that kind of makes sense. After all, it's the last Sunday of 2018. But today's also going to be the last in a series that I've been calling Road Trip. We've been looking at, for a number of weeks, the experience of the people of God from the time they left Egypt until they get to the Promised Land. And we're going to be looking at some endings today, and hopefully to do so, reminding you of this reality. And we've been doing this series called Road Trip because the people of God were being guided by God. They weren't just kind of living aimlessly. The Lord was guiding them, leading them, had purposes that He wanted to accomplish in them. And what was true for them is true for us. As they were on a journey with God, so too. If you're a follower of Christ, you're on a journey with God. And I hope you're aware of this, I don't mean to be morbid or anything, but at some point, your journey with the Lord, at least this side of heaven, is going to come to an end. There's going to be an ending to your trip this side of heaven. It may be sooner, it may be later, but an ending is in the future for all of us. Now, about that ending, there's a lot of stuff that you and I don't know that's outside our control. Like, you don't know exactly when it's going to happen. You don't know exactly where it's going to happen. And at this point, you don't know the circumstances that are actually going to bring it about. So there's all of this uncertainty with regard to your ending and to mine. But there's also this reality. In a very real and a significant way, you have the opportunity for your story, and I have the opportunity for my story to shape in a very real way what that ending looks like. Today, we're going to see a couple of endings, and hopefully it's going to lead us to give some real thought, not only in our minds, but also in our hearts, to what type of ending our trip with the Lord this side of heaven is going to look like. Look with me in your Bibles today to Deuteronomy chapter 34. Deuteronomy chapter 34. And I want you to leave your Bibles open because we're going to look at a couple of passages today that are close together. And I want you to leave your Bibles open because, among other things, the most important reality is this. You're hearing Michael's words. These are not Michael's words. These are God's words, and they're always more important than mine. So I want you to hear what this says. Deuteronomy 34. Let me set the context for you. The 40 years of wilderness wandering is over. The children of Israel are getting ready to go finally into the promised land. For 400 years as slaves, they looked forward to this. The entire journey getting to the promised land the first time, they were looking forward to it. Because of their disobedience, they couldn't go in. They've wandered for an additional 40 years. Finally, they're getting ready to go in. But we're told in verse 34 that Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which faces Jericho. And the Lord showed him all of the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and you see all these other descriptions. Verse 4, the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to your descendants." So bear in mind what's going on. Moses is at the top of a mountain. God has led him up there, and he's looking out on all of this territory. He's got an amazing perch at this point, and he's seeing all this, and God says, listen, this is what I have been promising you as my people for generations, all the way back to Abraham. I said this was going to be yours. Here it is. You're looking at it. But notice how verse 4 ends. He says, I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you will not cross into it. Verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the Lord's word. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, facing Beth Peor, and no one to this day knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not weak, and his vitality had not left him. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. And then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. And so Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. And the Israelites obeyed him and did as the Lord commanded. Verse 10, no prophet has risen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to all his officials, and to all his land, and for all the mighty acts of power and terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. All right, so we're talking about endings. You're reading the ending of Moses. As you read this, bear in mind and get in your mind the mental picture of how this is unfolding. Moses is 120 years old, and he's been leading the children of Israel now for generations. And he's been used by God to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. He has been the one that God had used to give the law to his people. Moses, if anybody was wanting to see the promised land, to go into the promised land, you've got to say it was him. Moses really wanted to experience this. But we looked at this a few weeks ago. And because Moses did something. You remember God told him to speak to the rock and Moses struck it twice? God said, you'll never step foot into it. But now God is giving him this opportunity to at least see it. But he's 120 years old, and this is his ending. He goes up the mountain. He sees this, and then he dies. God actually buries him. And so as you read what we're told here, you may think, you know what, that's not a bad ending. In fact, look at what we're told in verse 7. So he's 120 years old, so he has a long life. But and you're aware of this, those of you especially who are further down the road than I am. It's not just whether or not you're able to live longer. We want to be able to experience life with some quality of life with it. But look at Moses' quality of life. He's 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not weak. So Moses' vision was not affected like that of so many others. So he doesn't have cataracts probably, no glaucoma. I mean, there's probably no such thing as corrective vision in his days. And so at 120 years old, Moses is still able to see, which in that day would have been just a remarkable experience. Some of you are not 120 years old and you're like, I wish I could see. Beyond that, we're told his vitality had not left him. And so physically, Moses is not just kind of barely getting by. We're told physically he's in great shape. In fact, the greatest testament to his physical condition is this. He's 120 years old and has just climbed a mountain. Some of you are not 120 years old and just climbing out of bed this morning was not easy, right? So to be 120 years old and mountain climbing on your last day, you're probably thinking, hey, that's not a bad ending. So it seems that he's got his wits about him. He's not lost his mind. He's not affected by dementia or Alzheimer's. He's clear in his thoughts. He's clear in his vision. And he's still got his health and vitality. That's not a bad way to leave this world, is it? In fact, when he does die, his pallbearer, his burial team, is the Lord himself. The best you can hope for is maybe Haynes Lineberry or George Brothers, right? He gets God. How would you like that? That's a unique honor. But not only that, after he dies, the people they weep and they mourn. Don't you want people to be sad when you're gone? I don't want them to be, ding dong, the witch is dead, right? So people are sad. In fact, the mourning period goes for 30 days, and people are. This is a formalized period of mourning. Our great leader is gone. This one that has been by our side for generations, he is gone. And there was such profound sadness. You may say, that's a pretty good ending, isn't it? I'd kind of like that ending. In fact, by the time you get to verse 10, we're told that no prophet has arisen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And so it's saying of Moses, he had an unusual relationship with the Lord. A relationship like nobody before or since has experienced. Unusually close, an intimate relationship with God. Unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt. So you remember back all the plagues that God used Moses to announce, the parting of the Red Sea, all the miracles that God used Moses as the vehicle through whom these things came into being. All that's part of Moses' resume at this point. And again, you may be looking at this and saying, I feel like you're going somewhere with this. This doesn't sound like a great ending. But it sounds like a pretty good ending to me. Long life. I got my wits, got my sight, got my health. I've got all these accomplishments where God has been able to use me in the past. Honestly, what more could I hope for? Right? But pay attention back to verse 4. All of those things that you may deem to be so positive come after the last words Moses hears from God, which are these. I have let you see this land with your own eyes, but you will not cross into it. Isn't that interesting? The last thing that Moses hears, here is this land of great promise, but you will not experience it. You can see it, but you will not experience it. So, all this good, doesn't it seem like there is almost an asterisk to it? Long life, great health, can see well, got his wits about him, great accomplishments, but this didn't happen. Hold that thought for a moment. Turn one page over. Moses is dead. Verse 1 of Joshua 1. After the death of Moses, the Lord's servant spoke to Joshua, son of Nun. And he tells him, listen, Moses is dead. And then he begins to give Joshua a series of instructions. You and all the people prepare to cross over Jordan to the land I'm giving to the Israelites. He promises them in verse 4, he describes the parameters, the boundaries of the land that they will have. Verse 5, God promises, he says, no one will be able to stand against you as long as you live. I'll be with you as I was with Moses. I will not leave or abandon you. God tells Joshua, encourage the people, be strong and courageous. And he reminds them in verse 8 that the book of the law, the book of instruction, should not depart from them. Pay attention to the rules is what God is saying. By the time you get to verse 10, Joshua has received the message and now he begins to share it with the people and through his leaders. He commanded the officers of the people, verse 11, go throughout the camp and tell the people, get provisions ready for yourselves. Within 3 days, you will be crossing the Jordan to go in and take possession of the land the Lord God is going to give you to inherit. So the baton has been passed from Moses to Joshua, and he is picking up the baton and he is running gangbusters at this point. There's no hesitation. There's no, oh my, what are we going to do? Should we? In fact, you compare what Joshua does here to what happened 40 years before. You remember when the spies go into the land, they're like, oh no, the people are so big. We're like grasshoppers compared to these giants. It's just going to be a bloodbath. We can't take this. But you look at Joshua. He's saying, all right, I want you to get some food together, get some clothes. And within 3 days, we're crossing the Jordan and we're going in and we're taking this land. God is going to deposit it into our hands, into our possession. Let's get up and do this because the Lord has promised this. So it's an amazing turnaround of events, an amazing contrast to what has happened just 40 years earlier. So Joshua is the leader, and he begins to lead the people of God into the promised land. And you remember perhaps some of the victories that they experienced. The one that kind of set it off was the victory at Jericho. But as you go throughout the book of Joshua, you read what happens over the next series of generations, and I want you to skip to Joshua 24. And we're going to look at one more ending. Not only the ending to another book, but the ending to another life. Joshua 24. Joshua 24. We don't have time to read all of it. But if you go back to Joshua 23, you will read Joshua's final address to the people. He knows that he's getting ready to check off the scene as well. His days, his moments are now very few. And as he addresses them, he reminds them, these are all the great things that God has done for us. This is what we've experienced because God has done this for us. I'm getting ready to leave, but don't walk away from the Lord. Don't forget about Him. Remember that these blessings came from our obedience to Him. And so he's saying all of those types of things. And then that leads you to verse 29, where we're told after these things. So after he's finished this address, the Lord's servant Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. So he had 10 years less than Moses, but 110, that's still a long life, right? Verse 30, they buried him in his allotted territory at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. Israel worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had experienced all the works of the Lord had done for Israel. Verse 32, we're described how Joseph's bones were brought up from Egypt and how the promises made to Joseph had been kept. But it's interesting, as verse 31 ends, Joshua is dead, And we're told that during his lifetime and during the lifetime of the elders who outlived him, and all these people who had experienced all the works the Lord had done for Israel. Israel worshiped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and through theirs. All right, so here's what I want you to see. Joshua dies at 110. We don't know how vigorous his speech was, how much energy he had, how good his eyesight was. We don't know any of those details, but we do know this, that throughout the entirety of his leadership over the people of Israel walked with God. And his example was such, and his life was such. And it's not to say that he was perfect, that he was sinless, that he was any of those things, but his example was such that not only did they walk with God while he was alive, but all those who were part of the leadership that survived him during the entirety of that time, they still walked with God. Again, not that Joshua was perfect, but he so took serious his relationship with the Lord that he made sure he kept his vehicle in its lane. That doesn't mean that there were never any screw-ups, but he walked and led the people to walk closely with God. I want you to compare that ending to that of Moses. And as I read this, as I spend time thinking about this, it seems to me, for all the good stuff that was true of Moses, for how he had this unusual relationship with the Lord, for how God was able to use him in all these significant ways, but for the gift it was that he had this long life with great eyesight and great physical health condition, it still seems that there was this asterisk that is put on the ending of his life, where it became the story of still what could have been, what should have been, what ought to have been. You know, if you were to write the ending to Moses' life, wouldn't you say he leads the children of Israel into the promised land? That he's the one leading the charge and circling around the walls of Jericho? Doesn't it seem like that Moses should be the one that experienced this, right? But he doesn't. And there are still good things to be sure to be said of Moses, good things to be said of his life, good things that are in the rearview mirror, but it didn't have the ending that it should have been. I mean, his walk with the Lord this side of heaven was ultimately the story of what didn't happen, what could have happened, what should have happened, but just didn't. Compare that to the ending of Joshua. It seems, by contrast, that though Joshua wasn't perfect, here's a guy whose ending is one where there's literally nothing really negative to be said. That this is a guy that so took his walk with the Lord seriously that it impacted the entirety of the nation, so that the entire reign, the entire span of his leadership, the people walked with God. In fact, he cast such a long shadow that even the leadership after Joshua was gone led people to still walk with the Lord. Moses' ending seems like it was what could have been, what should have been. Joshua's ending is one where it seems like all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And everything that God wanted to do in Joshua's life, those things got checked off the list. The purposes that he had for Joshua, those purposes got fulfilled. The tasks that God desired Joshua to accomplish, he did them. You know, between these two endings, if you're a follower of God, my hope is that you would say, you know what, I think I like that ending better. That there's not unfinished business, that the stuff God wants me to do, I get it done. The purposes he wants to use me to accomplish, they get accomplished. The plans that he has for me, those things get fulfilled. That my story here doesn't end what could have been, what should have been, but wasn't to be. Let me just say, between those two endings, you get to decide which one you get. You get to decide whether your ending this side of heaven is a story of what could have been, or you get to decide if your story ends this side of heaven as the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed, and every plan and purpose that God wanted to use you for got to be accomplished. Well, how do you get that type of ending? Let me quickly give you a couple of thoughts. Here's the first one. Good starts do not guarantee good endings. Good starts do not guarantee good endings. Think about Moses' beginning for a moment. I mean, here's a guy, and maybe you remember the stories from your own Bible study or from Sunday school about how God miraculously spared his life when so many other Hebrew babies, male children, had been executed, that his mother, put him in that little raft, sent him in the bulrushes where Pharaoh's daughter pulled him out of the river, and he was able to be raised in Pharaoh's own household. So he starts off with a life of phenomenal material blessing. He gets the best education, the best food, the best exposure. He gets all of that. He has this unusual experience with God where God calls him through this burning bush. So there's this fire that's burning in this shrub, but the shrub is not being consumed, and the voice of God is audibly heard. And that's how Moses gets called into the Lord's service. I mean, he gets called into the Lord's service where he gets then directed to go toe-to-toe with Pharaoh and gets to be the one that announces that these plagues are going to happen. And then as they do, say, listen, God is saying, let my people go. He's the one that finally leads the children of Israel out and leads them to the shores of the Red Sea, and then is able to watch as the waters part, and he's able to lead the children of Israel through on dry ground. We've talked about a whole slew of the other things that he's been able to experience in recent weeks. I mean, honestly, could Moses have had a better start? I mean, this is a great start. Now, you kind of understand that if somebody has just a so-so beginning and a so-so middle, that a mediocre ending can be expected. But Moses doesn't have a so-so beginning. Moses doesn't have a mediocre middle. But it does seem that his ending is not with a bang, but with a bust. What does that tell us? It tells us just because you have a good start, in fact, just because you have a good middle, doesn't ensure that you're going to have a good ending. It's entirely possible that you're here as someone who would say, you know what, I really am. I'm a follower of God. I know that. I know where ultimately I'm going to spend eternity. I know that God loves me. I know that I believe, and I know that I try. I know all that stuff. I'm confident of that. But it's entirely possible that you are coasting. That you're operating because back in the rearview mirror, there's a lot of positive stuff. There were seasons of time where you were really close to God and you were really serious about studying your Bible and serious about spending time with God and serious about hearing from the Lord. And you got because of that you were serious about being used by and serving the Lord, and you're doing all this stuff in the rearview mirror. And it may be that you're coasting because that's part of your beginning, and you're thinking, okay, everything's going to be okay. All I'm telling you is this. Good starts do not necessitate and do not always result in good endings. Which leads me to the second thought, which is this. Your choices matter. All of them. Your choices, my choices matter. All of them. Why do I say that? Moses does not get the ending that he would have wanted. Moses does not get the ending that we probably would have scripted. But why doesn't Moses get that? Why does he just get to look over into the promised land and never actually step foot into it? Why does he not get to lead the children of Israel into the promised land? Because God told him to speak to a rock, and he struck it twice. Now, in the scheme of things, doesn't that seem kind of just nominal? Not that big of a deal? I mean, he crossed the line, he acted out of bounds, but, God said, speak the rock, he struck the rock, is it that big of a deal? And you got to think that at the time that it happened, Moses almost certainly didn't think it was that big of a deal. He got angry at the people, decided he didn't have to take seriously what God had said, and so he made a choice. But it was an entirely regrettable choice that would ultimately have lasting consequence and ultimately determine how his story this side of heaven would end. There's some important application for us in that, and here it is. there are choices, lots of choices that you know to be big and consequential. I mean, for those of you teenagers who are at or approaching the ending of high school, you're making and getting ready to make some big choices about what is going to happen. Do you go to college or not? Do you go to a four-year school? Do you go to a more technical school? Do you go to work or not? If you go to school, what do you major in? And if you're going to have a particular major, what school are you going to go to? Those are important decisions. They affect the trajectory of the rest of your life. Where you live, that's a pretty important decision. Whether you get married and who you marry, that's a really big one, isn't it? Whether you have children, if you're able to, and how many children you have, to the extent that's within your ability to control, that's a big decision. That's life-altering, isn't it? What job that you take, what type of work that you do. I mean, because you spend more of your time at work than you do any place else, at least of your waking hours, that's an important decision. That's really big. And so there's all these choices that you and I know, those things are really important. Those are, if we're going to triage it, we're going to put all those in the tier 1. All those in the tier 1. And it's easy for us to focus on those and say, I better get those decisions right. I mean, so long as I get those things right, the other stuff doesn't matter. Moses made some really big decisions. When God invited him to be the leader, Moses had to respond, and that was a big decision. When Moses had to finally muster his courage to go toe-to-toe with Pharaoh and say, this is the message from God, that was a big decision. That was a life-altering choice that he made. And there were a whole series of big decisions and big choices that Moses was making, and at the time he knew they were big. But it seems that Moses fell into a trap that oftentimes we fall into as well, which is this. So long as we get the big bases covered, the details don't matter that much. Let me ask you this. Why did Moses' ending look like it did? Because he struck a rock as opposed to speaking to a rock. What does that say to us? It says to us that the big choices matter, and so do the things that we think are insignificant, sometimes even trivial. It tells us and reminds us of this fact that all of our choices, all of mine, all of your choices matter. Why? Because, among other things, you don't know fully how that is going to affect. You don't know all the ripples that will come from that. You don't know all the lasting consequences that will come from that decision. Right now, it seems like it's not that big of a deal, but you have no idea. So the encouragement is, I believe from God's Word, is this, that we need to remember that every one of our choices, all of them matter because every one of them has the ability to affect in unaltering ways the trajectory of our life and even how our story ends. I'm not a big sports fan, but this past year I have probably watched, among other things, more football, whether professional or college, than probably in all my years before combined. And there have been more than a few games that I have watched that ended something like this. You've got a team, a football team, college or pro, that in the final minutes of the game, they are down by 1 or 2 points. They get the ball and they're headed towards their goal line. It gets to the point, it's less than a minute. We're now 3rd down. In fact, maybe we're even at 4th down. 20 yards away from the goal. It's possible, there's enough time on the clock to throw a pass and win by scoring a touchdown. But in those final seconds, you don't want to do that. You want to bring your kicker out to kick a field goal so that you go up by 1, up by 2 as the clock winds down. If you've watched any football, you've seen a game that probably ended something like what I'm describing. The kicker comes out. This is a chip shot. In practice, all day, every day. He makes this 20, 25-yard kick all day, every day. No big deal. But for some reason, something happens. There's a snafu. His foot doesn't land right, and all of a sudden the ball veers to the left or veers to the right. And what should have been a last-second victory, those hopes go up like dashed dreams. And you can see the look of just disappointment and sullen faces and shock. And if you've ever watched a game like that, or even in your mind's eye can envision a scenario like that, you really feel bad for that kicker, right? Because you're aware probably the rest of his team and the coach wants to kick him as well, right? I mean, you should have made this. This is easy. This is a no-brainer. You could do this blindfold. What's the matter with you? And even if they don't say it, he's heaping all that on himself, saying, man, I lost this game. It was on my shoulders and I blew it. We lost because I missed that kick. And you understand why he would feel that way. You understand perhaps even in part why others would project those thoughts onto him. But here's the question. Is that really true? Did that team lose a game because of one missed kick at the very end? I mean, did the only thing that mattered in a 60-minute game was it just what happened in the last 4 seconds? You know, what's interesting is that nobody's saying to the quarterback, you know, we lost this game because of that pass you threw 10 feet over the receiver's head near the end of the second quarter. If you'd just thrown it better, we would have scored a touchdown and that would have changed everything. What about the other receivers who dropped a pass? What about the offensive line that missed a tackle? Yet the kicker is blamed at the end. The kicker blames himself. Oh, isn't that interesting? When in truth, it wasn't just that. It wasn't that mistake. It could have been. It could have been these others. Yet he leaves with a thought: "It's all on me. It was all my fault." When there are all these other decisions, all these other choices, all of these other mistakes that put them in that scenario in the first place. You know what? It wasn't just that last second mistake that mattered. It was all of the other ones as well. But no one remembers that, do they? People remember the kicker that missed it. It was his fault. Why doesn't everyone remember the missed passes, the dropped balls, the missed tackles? Because those occurred earlier in the game, and there was always this thought: there's time left to make that up. We can still turn this around. We can do better next time. You know what? Unfortunately, I believe that same mentality carries over to us in life. And we, as a follower of God, will make some bad choices and some bungled decisions, and we'll think, well, it's not that big of a deal. I'll just do better next time. There's always going to be a next time. It wasn't that big of a deal. It was just kind of this. It was just kind of this piddly thing. It was this inconsequential thing. And we always operate as though there's always more time on the clock. But here's the reality. You don't know how much time is on the clock. You don't know if there's any time to fix it. You don't know if there's any time to do any better. You don't have any idea if there's going to be an opportunity to try to do better next time. You don't even know if there's going to be a next time. So what does that tell us? What I said just a moment ago. Your choices matter. All of them. All of them. So where does this leave you at the end of 2018 on the front door to 2019? My encouragement for you is to think beyond the moment. Don't just think, and some of you are spending a lot of time thinking about how 2018 is going to end and whether you have mild, medium, or hot wings on New Year's night, or whether you go to bed at 9 or you actually stay to see the ball drop in Times Square. You're going to spend a lot of time perhaps thinking about how this year ends. I want you to give some thought, not to be morbid, but to think about your ending. What will that look like? Because you have the ability to write the story. Your ending can be one of what could have been, should have been, but wasn't. Or it can be one where everything God wanted you to accomplish, all the purposes that He had for you, get fulfilled. Which of those stories do you want to write? My encouragement for you is to choose wisely. Will you bow your heads with me? You are, just like me, and that you are uncertain